tension, we might even use that Platonic term, the dialectic between duty and responsibility, between authority and liberty, all of those tensions will be here in this text. He will emphasize the importance of the individual. He will always consider that individual importance as being the beginnings of the higher pleasures, the sunum bonum, he will call it, of utilitarianism. Likewise, Mill will assert that democratic ideals will result in the tyranny of the majority, right? And among the standards proposed, Mill's three basic ones: liberties of individuals, three legitimate objections to government intervention, and finally the two maxims regarding the relationship of the individual to society. So this is kind of an overview of what the work looks like. Greatly influential work, and of course well received from the moment it was published. Now, according to Mill, in his autobiography, On Liberty actually started out as, in 1854, just a short essay, and it kind of evolved, right? His ideas developed, the essay was expanded, rewritten, and, of course, Harriet Taylor, his wife, had a tremendous role to play, right? We spoke about the mental breakdown, and ultimately, Mills will state that On Liberty, quote, was more directly and literally a joint project between he and Harriet than his own creation. The final draft, 1858, after his wife had died suddenly, all right? He in fact gave it to consecrate, he said, quote, to consecrate the text to her memory. He kind of devoted, you know, the rest of his life's work to her. It's a great love story. It's a great love story. Well, first the introduction. Here, Mill will open his essay by discussing the historical, quote, struggle between authority and liberty, end quote, right? Describing the tyranny of government, which in his view needs to be controlled by the liberty of the citizens, okay? He divides this control of authority into two mechanisms: necessary rights, which belong to citizens, and the, quote, establishment of constitutional checks by which the consent of the community or of a body of some sort supposed to represent its interests was made of a necessary condition to some of the more important acts of the governing power, quote. Because, he points out, society was in its early stages subjugated to pretty turbulent conditions. Small population, constant warfare, and the like. It was forced to accept rule, quote unquote, by a master. Now, Mill has taken a lot of heat for this. The support of a despotic or a tyrannical government by certain peoples who are, he even calls them barbaric. We'll say it out loud. Mill, of course, living before our time, is going to have some opinions and views that we obviously don't necessarily agree with. It doesn't mean we can't respect his views and his opinions. However, he makes the argument that as the progression of mankind occurred, it became conceivable for the people to ultimately rule themselves. Obviously, we think about Jeffersonian's views of democracy and the Declaration of Independence. Our lectures are available on that as well at Learn Strong, right? Mill does admit that this new form of society seemed immune to tyranny because, quote, he says, there was no fear of tyrannizing over self. Obviously, despite the hopes of the Enlightenment, Mill argues, the democratic ideals were not as easily met as expected, as obviously we are witnessed even to today, right? First, even in democracy, the rulers were not always the same sort of people as the ruled. This is the critique of Plato, obviously, in Republic, as we've outlined it from books 8 and 9. The declension of state argument from Republic. Second, he says there's a risk of what he calls, quote, a tyranny of the majority, end quote, in which the many oppress the few, who, according to democratic ideals, have just as much a right to pursue their legitimate ends. In Mill's view, he will say in the introduction, tyranny of the majority is worse than tyranny of government because it's not limited to a political function. Mill was deeply concerned about a large group of people silencing the minority, and the minority's views then not being heard. He says, where one can be protected from a tyrant, it's much harder to be protected against the tyranny of the prevailing opinion and feeling, end quote. The prevailing opinions within society will be the basis of all rules of conduct within society. Thus, there can be no safeguard in law against the tyranny of the majority. And then he will provide proof, obviously, as he's going to continue in his essay. The majority opinion may not be the correct opinion. And we're all together familiar with this, right? I mean, any study of any kind of authority structures will show often those authority structures are in fact flawed. They're wrong in some ways. Now, obviously, this doesn't mean that we just get rid of all the authority structures. I mean, this is kind of the extremist position, and Mill is no extremist in that regards. He says the only justification for a person's preference for a particular moral belief is that person's preference, right? What they want, right? Now, a particular issue that he analyzes, people will align themselves either for or against an issue. The side of greatest volume will prevail, but it's not necessarily correct. In conclusion to this analysis of past governments, Mill will propose a single standard for which a person's liberty may be restricted, that the only purpose for which power can be rightfully exercised over any member of a civilized community against his will is to prevent harm to others. Put it in your notes, is what we call the harm principle. And the idea is the only reasons why humans should ever be within society limited is so that they don't hurt themselves or somebody else. We'll get to the suicide question, by the way, later at the end of On Liberty. His own good, either physical or moral, is not a sufficient warrant over himself, over his body and mind. The individual is sovereign. The sovereignty of the individual, put it in your notes, the sovereignty of the individual is foundational to understanding the ideas of John Stuart Mill, his utilitarianism, and of course we could argue all of Western political thinking is in many ways rooted here. I mean, if so many of you are following the work of Jordan Peterson, he continually makes this argument that the greatest stories in the history of the world are stories which validate this idea of the sovereignty of the individual, which is why, of course, free speech is such a big deal to Mill as well as obviously to Peterson. Now Mill's going to clarify this standard based totally on utility, that is to say utilitarianism. When it's not useful, it can be ignored. For example, Mills will argue that children in barbarian nations, quote unquote, are benefited by limited freedom. We obviously will challenge sometimes notions of Mill in this regard. Just despots. He mentions Charlemagne, Akbar the Great, historically beneficial to people not yet fit to take them, rule themselves, take care of themselves. Finally, he concludes the introduction by discussing what he claims were three basic liberties in order of importance. One, freedom of thought and emotion, including the freedom to act on such thought, freedom of speech, in other words. Two, the freedom to pursue tastes, provided they don't harm others, even if they're deemed immoral. This is going to make Mill, for his day, pretty controversial. Three, the freedoms to unite, so long as the involved members are of age, the involved members are not forced, and no harm is done to others. Now, Mill admits that these freedoms could in certain situations be pushed aside. He claims that in contemporary and civilized society, there's no justification for their removal. We come now to chapter 2 of the liberty of thought and discussion. He attempts, Mill, to prove his claim from the first chapter that opinions ought never to be suppressed. Now this is powerful, powerful stuff, especially for the time in which we are living. Looking to the consequences of suppressing opinions, he concludes that opinions ought never to be suppressed, stating, quote, such prejudice or oversight, when it, the false belief, occurs, is altogether an evil. But it's one from which we cannot hope to be always exempt and must be regarded as the price paid for an inestimable good, end quote. He claims there are three sorts of beliefs that we can have. Wholly false beliefs, partly true, and wholly true, all of which, according to Mill, benefit the common good. As we've said often, the American philosopher Ken Wilber will say, no human mind is capable of 100% error. In other words, we've got to be willing to listen. This is epistemologically what we reference as the fallibilist position, and this is in many ways where it originates from. Obviously, it tracks back to Socrates and Plato, but it's this question of, can we listen to what other people have to say? Because we're so absolutely certain too often to our own demise, right? He says, first, if any opinion is compelled to silence, that opinion may, for aught we can certainly know to be true. In other words, you don't want to silence an opinion because it might end up being the one that really helps you or the group, right? To deny this, obviously, is to assume our own infallibility, the absolutist position. I am right, you are wrong, I have no reason to listen to you whatsoever. Just watch what's going on in our society or anywhere around the world, Watch an individual who is absolutely certain that he or she is absolutely right. And then watch to see if that individual is willing to entertain the possibility of fallibility. I could be wrong. Now, of course, we know already that the relativist position is, as we've said epistemologically, a waste of time. Mill knew it as well because of his study in logic. To say there are no truths is to posit a truth. To say there is no absolute is to posit an absolute. So obviously the relativist position goes away. But that doesn't mean that we have to be absolutists in our thinking. We can hold a position, and we can even hold it powerfully. And still, we can be willing to at least believe in the potentiality we could be wrong. And this is exactly what he's arguing. Secondly, he says, though the silenced opinion may be an error, it may and very commonly does contain a portion of truth, right? And since the general or prevailing opinion on any subject is rarely or never the whole truth, it's only by the collusion of adverse opinions that the remainder of the truth has any chance of being supplied. Go back to our lecture on Burke, Edmund Burke, the great conservative thinker. And he said the exact same thing. This is where political conservatism and liberalism will come together. The notion we must be willing to listen to each other, to hear what the other has to say. I was about to say if, but Mill would say especially if we don't agree with what the individual is saying. Find a political position that you really abhor. You need to find somebody who really believes in that position, and then listen to what they have to say. This is Mill's argument. This is foundational to a healthy democracy for Mill. Thirdly, even if the received opinion be not only true, but the whole truth, unless it's suffered to be, and actually is vigorously and earnestly contested, it will, he says, by most of those who receive it, be held in the manner of a prejudice, with little comprehension or feeling of its rational grounds. In other words, about any slogan, politically speaking, we want to pay very close attention to the language and ask, why do you believe that? What is it that leads you to believe in the slogan that you are speaking right now? And then let's talk about why that idea works, why that idea might be flawed or partially flawed. Right? He says not only this, but fourthly, the meaning of the doctrine itself will be in danger of being lost or enfeebled and deprived of its vital effect on the character and conduct, the dogma becoming a mere formal profession, right? Inefficacious for good, cumbering the ground, preventing the growth of any real and heartfelt conviction from reason or personal experience. Again, this is brilliantly prophetic. I mean, Mill points this out. When all we're doing is just simply expressing certain kinds of slogan-like language without any real thought about what it means. And if anybody contests our suggestion that this is absolutely true, we get really, really emotional and violent. Mill says there's something fundamentally dangerous about that kind of thing. It's a powerful idea. One more example of why a classic text from a few years ago can still speak directly to us today. Mill now will spend a large portion of the rest of chapter 2 discussing implications, right, and objections to the policy of never suppressing opinions. In doing so, he'll talk about Christian ethics, arguing that Christian ethics are praiseworthy, but they're incomplete on their own. This was pretty radical for his own day. Mill concludes, suppression of opinion based on belief in infallible doctrine is dangerous. And of course, he can use the history of the church to kind of make this observation. It's interesting the way that Mill will use any number of religious examples, both from Christianity as well as from Islam and elsewhere. Among the other objections Mill answers is the objection that the truth will necessarily survive persecution and that society need only teach the grounds for truth, not the objections to it. This is a powerful insight. The notion that we should be able to hear both sides of a position. Democracy is the most important form of government. Yeah, but let's hear Plato's critique on democracy in Republic 8:9. I don't want to hear any critique. No, Mill says you do need to hear critique. Doesn't mean that you have to believe that democracy is not the most important form of government. Your position will be stronger if you're willing to hear the opposite opinion. It's a compelling idea. By the end of chapter 2, Mill will state, quote, the unmeasured retribution enforced on the side of prevailing opinion deters people from expressing contrary opinion and from listening to those who express them, end quote. This is compelling. That is to say, when we have a society where individuals feel they cannot speak with their mind because they're afraid that a group of people will come after them, either physically or online or something like that, he says we're in some serious trouble. We may feel that we have the right to go after the minority voice, whatever that is, because they're wrong. But Mill will say, using the fallibilist position, epistemologically speaking, makes a whole lot more sense. And again, it comes back to this idea of humility. Let's go to the third chapter on individuality as one of the elements of well-being. Mill's going to point out the inherent value of individuality, since individuality is, in many ways, by definition, the thriving of the human person through the higher pleasures. And we go back to Republic 9 and listen to Plato, and this is where he got an argument like this idea. All humans have to be valued. All humans have lives that matter. No question. But no human lives matter until all human lives matter, for Mill. And the argument then here is, we've got to make sure that everybody is having the opportunity for the best, highest quality of life. Happiness, of course, is a huge part of the understanding of the utilitarian position. He's going to argue a society ought to attempt to promote individuality as it is a prerequisite for creativity, as well as, of course, diversity. And then, of course, he will begin to talk about why conformity is dangerous. And this will take us back to our comments on Ralph Waldo Emerson and self-reliance. He who would be a man must be a nonconformist and all of that. So much of what Mill has to say influencing tremendously American transcendental thought. He says that he fears Western society approaching this kind of what he called a well-intentioned conformity to praiseworthy maxims. And he kind of says it looks a lot like the Chinese civilization, right? He will conclude that actions in themselves don't matter. Really what matters is the person behind the action. The action together have to be constituted as valuable. He'll say it this way, quote, "It really is of importance not only what men do, but also what manner of men they are that do it." This is why he argues that education is so critical, because we are the stories that we tell and retell, the stories we accept, the stories we reject. He says, continuing quote, "Among the works of man, which human life is rightly employed in perfecting and beautifying, the first and important surely is man," we would say today obviously, "and woman himself herself. Supposing it were possible to get houses built, cornfields, corn grown, battles fought, causes tried, and even churches erected and prayer said by machinery, by automatons in human form," he says, "it would be a considerable loss to exchange for these automatons even the men and women who at present inhabit the more civilized parts of the world, and who assuredly are but starved specimens of what nature can and will produce." It's a brilliant insight. Before the smartphone, Mill was already gesturing towards the ways in which technology can change us, make us less human, less humane. He continues, human nature isn't a machine to be built after a model and set to do exactly the work prescribed for it. He rather says human nature, and this is one of his great word pictures, is a tree which requires to grow and develop itself on all sides according to the tendency of the inward forces which make it a living thing, obviously influenced by Francis Bacon's of Studies, where Bacon talks about natural abilities are like natural plants which must be pruned. The next time you want to critique your education harshly, ask yourself simply this: am I being helped to grow the way we help a tree to grow? And of course, some of that growth involves some pruning. And right, they even sometimes have pointed out, as we have said often in 303, sometimes you got to put a little bit of poop at the base of a young tree to help it to grow. Sometimes you got to go through some crap, as we say, right? You got to go through some bad stuff. It's good for you. What is it that we say? No longer ask, why is this happening to me, but rather, why is this happening for me? That's significantly important in his treatment in chapter 3. Let's go on now to chapter 4. The limits of authority of society over the individual. And this is, of course, one of the most famous chapters on liberty. Here, Mill's going to explain a system in which a person can discern what aspects of life should be governed by the individual and which by the society. I mean, if you're drawing pictures in your notes, maybe because you're bored of this lecture right now, you can just draw a little picture in which you put these two things against each other. The individual versus society, the group of individuals. Which one is more important? Which one has rights over the other, and when? Mill's basically going to hold that a person should be left as free as possible to pursue his or her own interests, as long as this doesn't harm the interests of others. Again, what we call the harm principle. In a situation such as this, he says, quote, society has jurisdiction over the person's conduct, end quote. He rejects the idea that this liberty is simply for the purpose of allowing selfish indifference. Rather, he's going to argue this liberal system will bring people to the good more effectively than physical and emotional coercion, right? Punishment of a certain kind. This principle will lead him to conclude that a person may, without fear of just punishment, do harm to himself through vice. In other words, Mill's very controversial in this count. If you want to go and harm yourself by drinking too much alcohol, that is your choice. That doesn't mean that society doesn't have some responsibility for you, but for the most part, Mill wants humans to remain free to do whatever they want to do. That is to say, as we've often said it in 303, we got to respect each other's right to fail. This is what we call justice, right? You got to respect a person's right. Teachers have to respect the student's right to fail. Students have a right to fail if that's what they choose. Now, obviously, we want to make sure that students are fully informed of what that choice means when they do fail, right? Governments, he claims, should only punish a person for neglecting to fulfill a duty to others or causing harm to others, not the vice that brought about the neglect. He spends then the rest of chapter 4 talking about how he responds to obviously some of the objections to his ideas. He will note the objection that he contradicts himself in granting societal interference with youth because they're irrational, but denying societal interference with certain adults though they act irrationally. In other words, Mill makes a distinction between a young person or child, someone who is being educated, and then the actual adult. Right? Mill first will respond by restating the claim that society ought to punish the harmful consequences